There are certain stories in the Bible that, as pastors, we love to talk about. Certain stories we enjoy telling, preaching on. They're the stories of victory, of faith, of courage, of obedience. They're the kind of stories that remind us of the good that we can become and accomplish as we follow after God. We love those stories. They're encouraging. And then there's other stories that I think we have a tendency to avoid. We don't like talking about very much. They're the stories that are on the other end of the spectrum. They're the stories of sin, of disobedience, of failure. Stories where people and relationships get damaged. We don't like talking about those. And I think one of the reasons is because, quite honestly, is they remind us as well of who we can become and what we can do, just on the negative side of it. This morning, as we are halfway through looking in the series, After God's Own Heart, we're looking at key moments in the life of David. This morning is one of those stories. It's a story, quite frankly, that puts an asterisk next to David's name. It's like Jose Canseco, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa. Right? Every single one of them has an asterisk next to their name. And what does the asterisk mean? They were great baseball players, but they cheated. Right? They took steroids. Or I think we need to take it a little bit closer to home. And this is maybe a little bit more sensitive, but we tend to use examples that keep things at a distance. So let me take it a little bit closer to us. And let's think of a couple names, like let's think of like Mark Driscoll, Bill Hybels, James McDonald. Every single one of them, if we're honest, and I know it makes us a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit sensitive about it, but let's just be honest. Every one of them has an asterisk next to their name. Why? Because they were pastors who had great influence and impact, but fell into great sin. Their lives got shipwrecked somewhere along the way. And that's David's story. You've got an asterisk next to his name. He is a man after God's own heart, leader, king of Israel, shepherd of God's people, and yet what? This story. And we need both of those stories. We need the after God's own heart stories. We need the stories of faith and courage and obedience, stories like David and Goliath. We need those stories to be encouraged and be reminded about who we can become and what we can be accomplished in our lives as God's at work within us. But we also need stories like this story of David and Bathsheba. First of all, because they are real life. The Bible is not full of stained glass saints. It's full of real people, and real people have brokenness just like David. But more than just because we need to see real life, David tells us here, or actually Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he tells us this. This is why we need stories like this. He says, now these things happened to them, and he's speaking about Israel, looking back to the Old Testament. These things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. Why do we have the Old Testament? It was written down for our instruction. The things that happened thousands of years ago are relevant to our lives today. They were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. And the end of the ages is the time between Jesus' first and second coming. Those things were written down for us. David's story, including and especially, is what Paul is focused on. The stories of failure and of sin were written down for our instruction. Therefore, he says, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Paul says, you want to know why we have stories of failure? Because here's the reality. They were given to us as a warning because everybody in the room is vulnerable. There's nobody in the room who is safe, who can't fall and have an asterisk next to their name. And so the challenge is that they were written for our instruction so that we can learn from their failure and figure out, okay, so how do we stand in the face of sin, in the face of struggles, in the face of temptation? How do we actually stand? And that's our big idea. It's there in your notes that are in your bulletin. If you want to take notes and write things down, here's the big idea. It's up on the screen. A man or a woman after God's own heart knows and fights against their vulnerability to temptation. If you are going to be the man after God's own heart, if you are going to stand as a woman after God's own heart, then you need to know your vulnerability. You need to be aware of it. But number two, not just aware of it, you need to actively, passionately, purposefully, intentionally be engaged in resisting and fighting against that temptation in your life. And through David's failure, God actually wants to teach us how to do that. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. Would you stand with me? Let's pray. And then we're going to read our passage together. For those of you who are visiting, we always stand when we read our passage because we believe that this is God's word to us, and we stand in honor as we read it. Let me pray for us. Father God, thank you for your word to us today. Thank you that we get to gather to be reminded of your grace at the very beginning, that our whole existence as your people is founded not on how good we are, but on how good you are. Not on how much we love you, but how much you've loved us, not by our works, but your work that has already been done for us through your Son, Jesus. Help us to not lose that context as we talk about sin and temptation and failure, disobedience. Help us to remember that, to keep that in mind. But God, I pray today that you would teach us how to stand. God, we all in this room struggle. And we all need this message, whether we're in elementary school or we're on the other end of the spectrum. There is nobody in the room that doesn't need this, myself included. So Lord, as you speak, God, I pray that all of those distractions and things that are going on in our heads that are keeping us busy inside, you would just calm that down, and that we would really be able to hear what you would have to say to us today and respond accordingly. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. And I want to read one other passage to you this morning. This is actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You don't have to turn there. Just listen. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation is overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. This is God's word. You go ahead and be seated. So as I was praying and saying, is that this is something that every single one of us in this room, it doesn't matter where you are, what age you are, what stage of life you're in, this is a message that is relevant for everybody in the room. And here's what if we're going to know our vulnerability and actually stand against it, to resist it, to fight it in our lives, then I think there's 4 things that we ought to be taking away from this passage this morning, 4 things that we ought to be learning from David's failure in this moment, all right? So here's what they are. Number 1, you've got to know you're vulnerable. You've got to know it, and that means you have to own it, which may sound really simple and obvious, but let me just say it very clearly. If David can fall into this kind of horrendous, horrific, heinous sin, because it certainly is, if David can fall into this, then who in the room can't? Who in the room is exempt from the possibility, the potential of falling into the same kind of things? I mean, this is not some immoral, uncaring, self-centered, narcissistic, atheist person who's saying, hey, I don't really care about God. I don't care about his commands. I don't care about following after him. I don't care about any of that. I just want to do my own thing. No, this is David, who, by the way, when remember, God says, I don't look on the surface, I look at the heart. And when God looks at David's heart, what does he say? Here's a man after my own heart. A man who will do all of my will. This is the same David who, by the way, when he was a shepherd boy, trusted God when bears and lions would attack his flock, and by faith would stand against them. God empowered him to be able to overcome them. This is the same David who, when he saw Goliath, even though he was small and Goliath was great, trusted in God to empower him to go and fight against the giant. This is the same David who sang and danced before the Lord. This is the same David who wrote the majority of the Psalms that you love to read. I love to read them. That same David is the David that did this. That David who wrote Psalms about the greatness of God's law. How about Psalm 119? Certainly, but how about Psalm 19? Where he says, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. Moreover, by them is your servant warned, in keeping them is great reward. David says, I love God's law. It stands as a warning, and that when I actually follow it, that I'm actually blessed by that. David, it's that same David who in this chapter blatantly, knowingly, willingly chooses. He didn't trip into it. It wasn't an accident. He chose, knowing full well that he was betraying a friend, because Uriah wasn't just some soldier. Uriah was one of David's mighty men. These were the men who were closest to David, who had fought and bled alongside of him, who had risked their lives for his sake. He didn't just betray a good friend of his, but ultimately he betrays God. Again, knowing full well what he's doing, because he knows who Bathsheba is, and he knows what God's law says. Certainly it says it in multiple places, but how about just very simply in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, you shall not commit what? Adultery. It's not like this is news to David. He knows full well all of those things, and yet he still willfully chooses to go into the sin. And not just that sin, by the way. I didn't read the rest of it, but it goes on from there. After she finds out after David finds out she's pregnant, he comes up with a plan to cover it up because he doesn't want to be found out. And so he tries to manipulate Uriah to come back from the battlefront where he's not there. Get Uriah back, trick him into being with his wife so that it will cover up the fact that this baby is his. And when that doesn't work because Uriah is too faithful of a soldier and man of God, David decides that in order to cover it up, the best plan is to have him murdered. Again, David, who wrote the Psalms that you love to read, that's what he did. He writes a letter to the general on the front, which, by the way, he makes Uriah carry to the front lines. And that letter is Uriah's death certificate. Because in it, he tells the general, when he comes back, send him to the worst fighting and then pull back so that when you pull back, he's murdered. He's dead. He's killed on the front lines. And that's what happens. He goes to the worst of the fighting. And in the process, he ends up getting killed. Bathsheba mourns for a little bit. And then David marries her. Again, the whole goal is cover it up. The same David knowingly, willingly chooses that kind of sin. And if he can fall into that, who in this room is exempt? Who in the room, including myself, who of us cannot fall into that kind of sin? See, the danger when we read stories like this is we have this tendency to go, oh man, David, I can't believe that David does this. I could never do that. We look at the sin of the people around us and we look at these, what we would look at as, say, major sins. And we look at that and we go, man, I could never do those kind of things. That's not me. And what we are doing in those moments is we look at the sins of other people and we dehumanize and demonize them. Because we go, real people, good people could never do those kind of things. People like me, we could never do those things. And so they must be less than human. They must basically be monsters and demons in the flesh. It's, by the way, what people did during World War II, after World War II as well, with the Nazis. When people found out in the United States especially, but around the world, when people found out the atrocities that had happened on the other side of the world, that's what they said. They said those must be monsters because there's no way that human beings could do those kind of things. But then the trials started to happen. And you know what they found? In fact, there was one woman by the name of Hannah Arendt, who was a Holocaust survivor, who was also a journalist, who attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the architects of the Holocaust. And when she came out of the trial, she wrote about the banality of evil. Do you know what that word banality means? It means ordinary, common. And she wasn't saying, by the way, that what he did was ordinary. What she was saying is that evil is ordinary to the human heart. In other words, let me just read exactly what she says. She writes this: despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster. In other words, he was not some satanic figure. He was an ordinary person. When she looked up there, she was shocked to find that there was somebody ordinary. She saw someone who was just like her, someone that was just like you, someone that was just like me. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. In other words, listen, he says, if you think that you couldn't do those things, if you think that you are better than those kinds of people and you don't have that kind of potential, you are actually more vulnerable to fall into those things. And here's why. Because you don't know reality. You don't know the reality of your heart, of the human heart. The banality of evil, the ordinary fact that evil exists in every single one of us, and you may not be, you are not the worst person you could possibly be. But the seeds of every horrible, horrific sin, the seeds exist within every human heart. Think of it like an acorn. Acorn is small, but put in the right environment, it can grow into a tree, but not just into a tree, it can grow into a forest. The seeds of sin exist in every single human heart that given the right environment, look at David, given the right environment, not only can it destroy your life, but it can explode into destroying the lives of everybody around you. That's the potential of sin. If you are going to stand up to the temptation that comes in your life, you've got to own your own vulnerability. It's John Owen, the great Puritan preacher, commentator, who once put it this way. He says, you have to be killing sin or sin is going to be killing you. And if you're going to be killing sin, hear this. It starts with the words of the old hymn, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. I have a vulnerability in my heart that exists, that I have the possibility, I have the tendency, I have the proclivity to fall into the exact same sins, to go down the same road, to have sin blow up my life. That's where it starts. That's number one. You've got to own the vulnerability. If you look at the sin of other people and shake your heads and go, I could never do that, then you are actually more vulnerable. You've got to acknowledge the reality of sin, the seeds of sin that exist in your life, given the right environment that can explode. Number two, you have to know where you're vulnerable. Not only are you vulnerable, but listen, everybody in the room is vulnerable. Paul says it in the very next verse there in 1 Corinthians 10. He says, no temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. In other words, if you're dealing with it, it's not like no one else deals with it. You are not the only one who deals with whatever your temptation is, right? At the same time, you are not tempted by everything that everyone else is tempted by. And everyone else is not tempted by everything that everyone else is tempted by. Everyone has specific things, specific areas of vulnerability in their lives, specific areas of weakness. For David, what's his vulnerability? Where is he weak? It's with women. Right? And by the way, this isn't the first time that David has a problem with women. I know sometimes we come to this passage and we go, wow, where did that even come from? As if it was suddenly out of the blue. Which is the way that we tend to see when we see someone publicly sin and fall. We tend to look at that and go, man, that's so shocking and surprising. I didn't see that coming. And most likely you didn't see it coming. But here's what you need to know. Anytime you see it publicly, it's not sudden. There was a journey to get there. This was not the first time that David had a problem here. This was David's area of weakness. And I won't go into all the details, but let me just take you to one place, 2 Samuel chapter 5. It says this, it said, and David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now listen to the very next thing that it says. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. So on the one hand, it says David realizes God's blessing his kingdom. His kingdom is being established. God is expanding it for the sake of his people. But then the very next thing it says is what? And David's sinning. David is expanding. He's increasing his wives. And we know that sin because if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, when God is talking about establishing a king for Israel, he makes very clear there are certain things the king is supposed to do and certain things the king is not supposed to do. And one of the things that he makes clear, listen to this. He says, the king, neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. One of the things that God is crystal clear about in terms of what a king is not supposed to do is he's not supposed to be multiplying his wives, lest his heart turn away. What does David do? David multiplies his wives, he disobeys God, and his heart is turned away, which how shocking is it to us to realize how much of a problem he must have, because not only does he have one wife, he's got all sorts of wives, and that's still not enough for him. He's got to go after his friend's wife. This is David's area of vulnerability, and here's the thing about it. Everybody in the room has an area of vulnerability. At least one area where you have weakness in your life. And the question is, what is it? It could be just simple pride. It could be self-centeredness. It could be self-pity. It could be gossip. It could be, quite frankly, food. It could be eating too much. I'm going to talk about that in just a second for myself. It could be pleasure. It could be lust. It could be, there's so many ways, so many places that we can have weakness in our life, but the question is, where is it for you? And here's why this is so important, is because we have an enemy who is a master fisherman. He's a master fisherman. Have you ever known someone who's just really good at fishing? I have a friend, and some of you actually, you know him. He's your friend as well, at least until he sinned and moved away to Tennessee. And now we pray for him. And I'm kidding, for those of you who are visiting. Do we think that moving to Tennessee is a sin? Yes, we do. Corey Stewart, he was one of our elders of the church for a while, and they moved down to Tennessee. And he's a great fisherman. And in fact, I was down there this summer. We went down to the Smoky Mountains and we visited with them. And I asked him, listen, if I fish down here, which I actually never ended up fishing. That shows what kind of a fisherman I am. I said, if I fish down here, what do I need to fish with? And Corey said, hey, listen, I've got plenty of lures for you to use. And he literally has boxes and boxes and boxes of lures. Here's why. Because a great fisherman knows that not every lure works for every fish. If you want to catch a particular fish, you need to know what kind of lure to use. And the thing about our enemy is he is eternally deceived, but he is not stupid when it comes to temptation. And he knows that not every lure works with every person in the room, but he knows what lure works with you. And the problem is this: if you don't know what that lure is, if you don't know your area of vulnerability, then you're not ready for when he keeps casting. And by the way, he knows what lure to use, he knows where to cast it in your life, and he's going to keep casting it and casting it. And if you don't know what that vulnerability is, you're not ready to fight it. And it's not a question of if, it's just a matter of when are you going to take the bait, because you're not ready to deal with it. Number 3, if you're going to stand against it. Right? Before I move on to that, here's the question you've got to answer. If you're going to get to where, here's the question. You ready? Where do you tend to say yes to things that God clearly calls you to say no to? Where do you say yes to things that God clearly calls you to say no to? Whatever the answer is to that question, and by the way, if you say nowhere, then you need to... You're blind to your own heart at that point, because everybody has somewhere. Number 1, you've got to know you're vulnerable. Number 2, you've got to know where you're vulnerable. Number 3, you've got to know when you're vulnerable. When you're vulnerable. I said I was going to talk about food and eating, and I'm going to be a little bit transparent with you this morning. One of the struggles that I've had in my life is with food. I tend to use food as a coping mechanism, particularly when I get stressed. And, you know, it would be really great if that coping mechanism, like when you get stressed and food is your thing, if it was like, man, I really need some celery right now. Like, wouldn't that be awesome? I mean, we'd be so super thin and fit because, you know, there's a lot of stress in life and we'd be eating celery all the time. But no, that's not it. It's the temptation is, where's the next thing of junk food where's the chocolate, where's the chips, whatever that is for you. And quite frankly, for me, it's anything that's bad. But here's the thing that I found, and Sarah can confirm this for you. During the day, I'm fine. You could put some of my favorite food in front of me, which, by the way, you know what one of my great weaknesses along the way has been? Peanut butter. I will take a jar of peanut butter, and some of you will be grossed out by this. That's fine. I'll gross you out. And I will just take a spoon, and I'll just sit there and eat it. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you feel so much better with life as a result, for like 3 seconds. I'm fine during the day. You could put a jar of peanut butter in front of me all day long. But do you know when I have a problem with food? Do you know when it is? Nighttime. Everything calms down. Everything slows down. I lay down in bed and suddenly I'm hungry for peanut butter. Or anything else that's available for me that's unhealthy, right? I go down and I'll open up the refrigerator. That's when I am the weakest. See, you're not weak all of the time. There are moments. David was on the battlefield and he didn't fall. David was struggling with Saul trying to take his life and he didn't fall in the way that he falls in this passage. Here he is. And what's the context? What's his when? Here's his when. Number 1, it's a moment of success. David's kingdom is expanding and he's able to stay at home while his army goes out to fight. Number two, it's in a moment of leisure. The passage is really clear. If you look at verse 1, it says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, what does David do? So kings are going out to fight, which, by the way, up to this point in time, that's been David's pattern. If his army's at war, where's he? He's at battle. But here, he stays home. And not only does he stay home, it says in verse 2, it says it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. So it's late in the afternoon, he's been on his couch. Here's how I picture David. David is in sweatpants, and he is wearing that old high school shirt. Still got it. And it's got stains on it, but it's got some new stains because he was eating food, because it's, And he wakes up late afternoon, and he gets up and he goes up onto his roof, and that's when he sees Bathsheba. It's a moment of leisure, and third, it's a moment of isolation. Because all of his closest warriors, where are they? They're out on the battlefront fighting, and where's he? He's in his room hanging out on his couch. And I can relate to every single piece of that. I get it because, what happened? The moment of success. Why is that a moment of vulnerability? Here's why. When the battle is raging, do you know what you're very aware of? How much you need God. But when everything calms down, do you know what happens? Your need gets muddy. You start going, I'm not sure that I need to be praying as much as I was, or I need to be in my Bible as much as that I was when everything was crazy. And you let down your guard. And the moment you do that, what is that? It makes you vulnerable. I get leisure being a moment where temptation happens because when I rest from my work, it's also easy for me to let my guard down in regard to the spiritual battle that's going on. I get the isolation piece because when I've got people around me, even people who, by the way, are encouraging me to go the wrong way, having that community, having those people in place, there's something about non-isolation that makes me aware of the battle. But when I'm on my own, it's easy to be tricked into believing the lies. I get it. The question that you've got to ask yourself very simply is this. When are you vulnerable? When is that for you? Maybe it's in moments of success, or maybe it's in moments of failure when everything is falling apart and you feel just beat up and you feel like a nobody, and that's when you are most vulnerable to temptation because that's your escape. Maybe it's in moments of rest, or maybe it's in moments of stress because that's your way of escaping all the stress. Maybe it's when you're tired. Maybe it's when you're hungry. Whatever it is, you've got to click clear on your when, because here's the thing. Not only does the enemy know what lure to use, a master fisherman knows when to use it. Right? If you're a fisherman, some of you people have no idea about fishing, but some of you do know that you don't fish in the middle of the day when the sun is at its highest. When do you go out fishing? When are the fish most likely to bite? Early in the morning, later in the evening. That's when they're biting. And see, the enemy, again, eternally deceived. He's not stupid when it comes to temptation. He knows where to cast and he knows when to cast in your life. And if you don't know when that vulnerability is, then you're not ready to actually do battle. Number 4, if we're going to stand, this is the last thing, is you've got to know the escape plan. You've got to know the escape plan. The bad news that Paul has been telling us and David is showing us is that we're vulnerable to temptation. We can all certainly fall in that sin, but here's the good news. This is 1 Corinthians 10:13. God is faithful and will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. God's faithful. Are you going to be tempted? Yes. Are you vulnerable? Yes. But God is faithful, and here's what the promise is. God will give you everything that you need in order to stand in victory in the middle of temptation. And we could spend a lot of time, I'll be honest with you, I'd written a lot of points under this one point that I was going to share with you, but we don't have time for all of them, so I'm going to give you the number one thing that God's given you. And you've got to dig and you've got to get practical in dealing with the when and the where that you actually face that vulnerability in your life. But let me give you the biggest thing that God has given you, given us, in terms of standing in the middle of that temptation. Are you ready? Here's what it is. God's given us the truth. And not just information. Certainly, God's word is truth, and this is the sword of the Spirit that he's given to us to do battle with the enemy. But when I'm talking about truth, I'm not talking about it as just information. Truth is a person. Jesus says it. He says, I am the way and what? The truth. You see, Jesus, by his life and his teaching, by his death and burial and resurrection, through the gospel, he reveals to us the truth. And there's two key things that he shows us in regards to truth when it comes to standing in temptation. Here's what they are. Number one, he shows us that every temptation is built on a lie. Every temptation is built on a lie. And here's the lie of every temptation. Sin will give you everything that you want with no consequences. Sin will give you what you're looking for. Sin is the answer to the longings of your heart. And the problem is that it's a lie, and here's how we know it's a lie, because on the cross, what is Jesus showing us? That the wages of sin is what? It's death. That the result of sin, that you're being told that, hey, it'll satisfy you, it'll fill you up, no one will ever know. There won't be any consequences. You'll be satisfied. Every single one of those pieces comes down at the end of your life. By the end of it, you will know that every single piece of that was a lie. And Jesus shows it on the cross. It's why he had to die, because we bought into the lie, because every single one of us, all of us sinned and fall short of God's glory, and the wages of sin is death. Jesus isn't dying for his sin, he's dying for ours. Because we gave into the lie of temptation every single time. David believed so many lies. In this one moment in his life, there were so many lies that he bought into, and it destroyed his life. And that's the end result of sin. Number two, second truth is this, is that God loves you. God loves you. That in the middle of all of your sin, in the middle of all your failure, in the middle of giving into temptation, in direct and willful disobedience, that God loves you so much that he sends his son Jesus to come into this world, to go to the cross in your place, to pay the penalty for your sins, to die, to be buried, to rise again, to conquer sin and death, to purchase you a gift of salvation, to bring you back into a right relationship with God. And take that just a step further for a moment. Do you know what that says about everything that God says? All of God's commands, all of God's word to us, sin is based on a lie. And all of God's love, all of God's word is based on his love and truth. If God says no, he's not keeping you from joy. He's trying to protect you for it. If God says don't go that way, it's not because he's trying to keep you from life. He's trying to save you for it. See, what the cross tells you is sin is a lie, and his word and his commands are actually true. Sin is going to destroy you, but where he's leading you to, where he's calling you to, the things that he's calling you to do, those things that's the way of life. And see, the more that you fix your eyes on Jesus, on the gospel, on the cross, the more that you see the lie that sin is and the truth that is his word and his call and his commands to you in your life. John Owen says it this way: to respond to the distorting nature of sin, you must set your affections on the beauty and the glory of God, the loveliness of Christ, and the wonder of the gospel. Were our affections filled, taken up, and possessed with these things, what access could sin with its tainted pleasures, with its sugared poisons, with its envenomed baits have unto our souls? He says, here's the thing that God has given us. The mighty tool to reveal the lie of sin and the truth of his word. It's the reality of the gospel painted in full for us on the cross and through the empty tomb. Temptation is built on a lie, and his commands are built on the truth, grounded in his love for you. And when you see that, it gives you the ability to actually stand, and not just stand. You know, here we are, and we're talking about how to stand in temptation. And some of us here this morning, we're on the other side of that in failure like David. And you're going great talking about how to stand, but man, I don't even know what to do, because here I am, and I'm in the mess. I've made the choice. I've blown up my life. I've been hiding it, and I've been covering it up. And here's the good news, that David's story tells us two things. Number one, we're vulnerable and we can certainly fall in sin. But number two, get this, that God doesn't give up on you even in that failure. God does not run away from you. He doesn't walk away and say, fine, forget it, I'm done with you. You say, what do I do in this moment? Because listen, I know what it's like to be in that place where you're hiding it and you're afraid that people are going to find out, and you're trying to cover it over. David knows. He talks about it in Psalm 32 and says, man, it's eating you up on the inside. I know it is. It's tearing you down. It's zapping your energy. You're depressed. You're anxious. You're overwhelmed. And because you're hiding the sin, so what do? You got to take it and you got to bring it out. Psalm 32, he says, I acknowledged my sin to you, God. I did not cover my iniquity. This is where he changes direction. I said, I'll confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. God wants to meet you this morning with his grace, love, and forgiveness that's made possible through his son, Jesus Christ, on the cross and through the empty tomb. You say, what do I do in the middle of my brokenness? See, David's story doesn't show us just how to stand. It shows us how to get back up again. And the answer is this, is that we come and we confess our sin to God in the context of his grace and love through his son, Jesus Christ, his finished work. And when we do that, here's what his word tells us. He's faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. And in the process, we repent. And that word repent simply means I surrender control. The reason I sin is because I wrestled control and now I need to give it back. And as I do that not with an angry, uncaring, ruthless judge. But I do that with the God who is like the Father, who is sitting and watching for his son a long ways off, sees him coming home from the pigsty where he's been living in disobedience, in the filth of his decisions. And the Father sees him coming a long ways off. And what does the Father do? He runs at his son, not in anger, not in wrath, not in hatred, not in judgment, but in grace and in mercy and love, and throws his arms around his son, embracing him in his filth, not giving him a list of here's how you've got to earn it back, but saying, I've done it all for you. Here's the robe, here's the ring, here's the sandals on your feet, and let's throw a party because this child of mine was dead and is alive. He's lost and he's found. And I want you to hear this today. God's invitation to you. For those of you who are standing, he says, here's how you keep standing. For those of you who are fallen, his invitation to you today is come back home. Come back home. Let today be that day.